My soul, there is a country far beyond the stars, where stands a winged sentry, all skillful in the wars. There, above noise and danger, sweet peace sits crowned with smiles, and one born in a manger commands the beauteous files. He is thy gracious friend, and, O my soul, awake, did in pure love descend to die here for thy sake. If thou canst get but thither, there grows the flower of peace, the rose that cannot wither, thy fortress and thy ease. Leave then thy foolish ranges, for none can thee secure, but one who never changes, thy God, thy life, thy cure. This poem of Henry Vaughan was set to a Bach chorale tune, and it's number 181 in the Red Hymnal. Henry Vaughan was born in 1621 and died in 1695. He enjoyed only a brief interlude of poetry in his long life. He spent 2 years at Oxford and then went to London to study law. But his studies were interrupted by the civil wars, in which he took a brief part on the king's side. After the royal defeat, he retired to his native Wales and began to practice medicine. In 1650, he wrote a book of poetry entitled Silex Scintillans. The fiery flint, referring to the stony hardness of his heart from which divine steel strikes fire. George Herbert's poetry made a great impression on him. And the religious poetry, on which his reputation largely depends, is full of echoes from the temple. Vaughan's best poems are direct and untangled in their expression. They tend to start with a brilliant phrase or set of phrases and trail off into relatively prosaic meditations. Sparkles of poetic brightness attend most of his writings, but they glow irregularly and fade under the unsteady breath of the poet's personal inspiration. When that inspiration is up, he sees, or tries to see, through the veil of things to the spiritual quick of life lying just under its commonplace material surface. There is a kind of silver gray purity in Vaughan's finest work, which, though comparable to Herbert's and tangibly influenced by it, is more nervous and restive, more apt to dissolve the physical book under our hands, turning it into the living mind and immediate soul of a man. All three poets treated by Wall in his book, inherited the issue from Petrarch of the relation between eros and divine love. For Petrarch, both eros and divine love would occupy the same narrative only by placing them in opposition, so that the former is rejected to get to the latter. Spencer's revolution was to declare that all of human love was properly understood in relationship to a single narrative, the divine work in human history, with the domesticated eros functioning as a channel for the divine activity. Herbert's variation was to declare that love came to have meaning as a term for human experience, including erotic experience, when it took its place within and in relationship to the narrative of a divine human relationship. All, through variations on the relationship between erotic and divine love, find ways in which, both within the same narrative. For Vaughan, however, the divine human interactions created in and through his poems must proceed, perhaps side by side, with other human narratives, but to a great degree independent of them. The consequence of social change for Vaughan, therefore, was to make what Vaughan thought of as the narrative of true religion take place parallel to the narratives of eros, but on separate paths. Their stories, their worlds had been put asunder. These three poets coincide with three stages in the history of the Church of England. Elizabeth and Spencer were contemporaries, and during Elizabeth's reign, the Church of England aspired to be the church, the only church in England. But by 1630, when Herbert was installed as rector at Beamerton, it was clear that neither the Puritans nor the Catholics were going to conform. And therefore, the Church of England could only be a church in England. In 1650, when Vaughan started to write his religious poems, the Church of England was no church in England. On January the 3rd, 1645, Parliament declared the prayer book illegal. And a week later, William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury, was executed on Tower Hill. 4 years later, Charles I followed his archbishop to the scaffold. Anglican worship, from Vaughan's position in the early 1650s, was officially forbidden. Conducted clandestinely, if it occurred at all, and appeared unlikely ever to be restored. Such records as exist imply that prayer book worship did continue, but infrequently, on a drastically reduced scale, and in the secrecy of private homes. Penalties for non-compliance with the new order of worship and persistence in the old rite were progressively increased until after December the 15th, 1655, none of the Church of England should dare to preach or administer sacraments, teach school, etc., on pains of imprisonment or exile. Use of the Anglican prayer book in any form, including its liturgical calendars and accompanying ceremonial, was abolished as a public occurrence. The ongoing life of the Anglican Church had come to an end, at least in the forms in which it had been known and experienced since 1559. In considering Vaughan, therefore, we have to keep firmly in mind the situation of Anglicans after the Civil War. The community where Spencer and Herbert found their understanding of God through participation in the tradition of liturgical enactment enabled by the Book of Common Prayer was now absent. Vaughan is the poet of that absence. Writing in the 1650s, he is the chronicler of the experience of that community when its source of Christian identity was no longer available. What Vaughan engaged in during this period was an effort to keeping alive the implications of the prayer book church during a time when the church was a part of the past, or at best, a surreptitious activity in which to participate was to put one into opposition to the very state whose destiny had once seemed informed, created, and enabled by the ongoing life of that church. Here in Canada, the 1980s introduced a period that was similar, that is similar to that of England under the Commonwealth. The Anglican Church was not suppressed, but since 1951, 53% of its membership had left the church, and the prayer book was made responsible for these losses. Therefore, in 1985, Synod approved a modern service book. This service book was approved as an alternative to the prayer book, and it is called the Book of Alternative Services, but it has actually been used as a replacement of the prayer book. The prayer book's replacement has meant the suppression of a language. And in August of 1998, Sarah Thompson did a sociolinguistic research project entitled The Prayer Book Example: Why the Words Matter. The purpose of this project is to learn why the prayer book language is valued by members of the Prayer Book Society, and to document how the pressure on their preferred language in community worship is affecting them. I'm not going to try to summarize this important article. It deserved to be published, but publication was blocked, ironically, by the Prayer Book Society itself. Instead, I will read from the conclusion. The various linguistic features of the prayer book are interwoven. One participant compared the holistic quality of prayer book language to the healing power of organic medicines properly combined. From another's perspective, The prayer book is an integrated work put together like a fine Swiss watch. Participants believe that within the church and as part of a praying community in a formal setting, the historic and reverential language of the prayer book is to be preferred. Participants in the study express feelings of sadness, loss, and marginalization. They resent not being taken seriously and being thought of as inflexible. Many of the older participants feel a great sadness for future generations who may be deprived of the rich traditions they have known and find the battle for the continued use of the prayer book soul-destroying. Language is a system of meaningful sounds, a system in which sound is every bit as important as meaning. In the old days when Cranmer's collects were memorized, they were memorized as much for their sound and for the beauty of the language as for what they said. Prayer book language lives on the ear like a music that can never be forgotten. It has been said that its felicities often seem to be almost things rather than mere words. There was wisdom in the advice of a previous pope who said, what previous generations have considered sacred, we should consider sacred also. In 1660, with the restoration of the monarchy, the prayer book was reinstated in England. Here in Canada, if there is a level playing field, the prayer book can make a comeback. Why? Because the prayer book is a classic, and a classic speaks for itself. That is the art of the prayer book. Thank you.